The creation of dust, one of the main power systems of the RWBY series, initially introduced to us as nature's wrath in the very first episode. Since then, though, we've come to learn quite a bit more about dust, all of the different types that exist, the nature of dust in and of itself, how it was brought into the world of Remnant, but we don't actually know much more than that. Because in fact, there is a science behind dust. Even though we have learned that dust is the elemental remnants of magic that were possessed by the first generation of humanity, and when the first generation of humanity was dusted by the god of darkness and turned into, well, dust, the elemental components of that magic seeped into the ground and, over time, thousands of years, perhaps even longer, formed into the dust crystals that the people of Remnant now use today. And whatever magical properties that were left over in that primordial ooze of dust that was, at one point in time, the previous generation of humanity, that is what gave rise to the current generation of humanity and faunus that we now see today. And that magic resulted in semblance. That is why semblance and dust can work together, because they do originate from the same source. However, they are very different things. I've gone over this in other videos, the relationship between dust, semblance, and magic, but when it comes to dust specifically, although it's something that has been used by the people of Remnant, the second generation of the population of Remnant, since very early on in its history. We see when Ozpin is first reincarnated into this world that dust crystals are there, but they haven't really been refined, and especially technology has not been created that utilizes dust to the same extent that exists now in Remnant. People were still incorporating it into weapons, and we know of the more archaic form of sewing dust into clothing. Given that dust appears as crystals and then can be ground further into powder, I don't know how exactly one would weave that into clothing, but the technology exists for that to be possible. Granted, I can't imagine that's an easy process. Since that time, though, dust has gone through quite a bit of a revolution of sorts since the time of the Great War in the RWBY series. In the past 100 years, technology has exploded on Remnant, and dust is the cause. Research has been done into dust to manufacture new types of dust, to find new utilities for dust. And there is a science behind that. And on that note, this would be the most opportune time to mention that this video idea, the science of dust, was one requested by Bloody Rosalia, who redeemed on Twitch for me to make this video. For those who don't know, I stream on Twitch a couple times a week, and through accruing channel points, admittedly a large number of channel points, there are various redeems that will be available. One of which being to request for me to make a video of your choosing. Of course, with my own discretion as to it has to be related to RWBY, etc. So, if that's something that might interest you, then by all means check out the Twitch channel, come hang out for a while, and maybe you too can have a video made upon your request. But with that being said, we as the viewers are not really privy to the science behind dust, as it's not been really touched upon in the RWBY series, and, you know, the interviews and Q&As that we've seen from the writers hasn't really gone too in-depth. And it's even possible that the entire science behind dust hasn't even been fully fleshed out, because it doesn't really need to be for one's understanding of the RWBY series, as long as you know that, for example, fire and water dust can give you steam dust, then you don't really need to know the minute details behind it. But that is where I find that really interesting as someone who is a chemist. When it comes to dust, there are 4 basic elements. We have fire, water, wind, and lightning as our 4 building blocks of every other type of dust. In some way, shape, or form, every other type of dust that we have ever encountered in the RWBY series and ever will encounter in the RWBY series, presumably, unless they're going to do some weird shenanigans with the Ever After, comes from these 4 types of dust. And so with these 4 basic types of dust, we can essentially treat these as the periodic table of dust. From these 4, everything else has to originate. For example, fire dust and water dust gives us steam dust. We have wind dust and water dust giving us ice dust. And then we have fire dust and wind dust giving us combustion dust. And those are really the combinations that we know the exact components of, but we don't know how exactly they are mixed. Because I am certain that, similarly to chemistry, as it would be with dust, it is not just, okay, you have one fire dust crystal, you have one wind dust crystal, smash them together using some combination of pressure or temperature. Maybe there's a catalyst involved that would accelerate the reaction. Then, fire dust and wind dust immediately becomes an equivalent amount of combustion dust. That's not how chemistry works. That's not how the science behind dust would work either. It has been stated by Miles Luna that a majority of these different types of dust do occur naturally in the environment. When there are naturally occurring veins of the 4 basic types of dust, and they occur together, then they can form naturally whatever combination of dust that the components would create. Using combustion dust as the example again, if there is a vein of fire dust and a vein of wind dust that occur naturally very close to one another, then they could form a pocket of combustion dust between them. But it is not a one-to-one mixture. At least, I'd imagine it wouldn't be. Especially with components that are solids like dust is. As I mentioned, dust are crystals. They are not something like a liquid that can be easily mixed. So in nature, dust, when it combines together to form a new type of dust, it's not only that the building blocks have to be in place for that reaction to happen, but there would also likely have to be an increasing amount of temperature as well as pressure, being buried underneath of the earth, and probably other environmental factors that we haven't even really considered or been introduced to. Because if we think about it, Remnant, although we can equate a lot of things that happen and occur on Remnant, at least with the planet itself, as somewhat equivalent to Earth, and very likely Earth being the basis for Remnant's construction, there could be a lot of other things that are happening with the chemistry of the land that could influence the creation of different types of dust. And initially, how these veins of dust crystals are formed in the first place. Why there are places in Remnant that have a much higher concentration of dust. For example, Vacuo had some high concentrations, but was stripped clean by Mistral and Atlas. As well as Atlas has a high concentration of dust underneath of it as well. Likely, that was just where a large portion of the first generation of humanity was when they eventually got dusted, and so a high portion of their magic seeped into the ground in those areas, but we don't actually know for sure. Outside of that though, getting back to the production of other types of dust, as I mentioned with ice dust, steam dust, and combustion dust, those we know what building blocks are actually used to create them, but we don't know in what proportion that they actually need to be in. For example, steam dust, do we just need a 75% water and 25% fire? Do we need a 50-50 mix? We don't know the exact proportion that would be needed to create any of these different types of dust. Presumably, and logically, to get a certain amount of steam dust, you would need the exact amount of fire dust that would produce enough heat to evaporate the amount of water that it would be combined with to create that steam dust, if that makes sense. And the kicker is, although this does occur naturally, Atlas has been able to figure out these proportions. That is why the Schnee Dust Company and Atlas in and of itself is so successful. Atlas is considered the father of hard light dust. This is a dust type that, as far as we know, does not occur naturally. And it has been stated that it is a combination of all 4 basic elements of dust, containing fire, wind, water, and lightning in some proportion. Again, we have not been told what the proportions are of any dust that has been created outside of the 4 basic ones that just occur naturally. Hard light dust could be a majority of lightning dust, with a little bit of water, winds, and fire added in, or it could be proportionally different. We don't know the exact chemistry behind it, and unfortunately, there are fewer people on Remnant now than there were, 1 or 2 volumes ago that did know that science. Because now that Atlas is gone, the creation of most of these combinations of dust is going to become nigh impossible because they don't have the technology anymore to combine those different types of dust. Because, well, Atlas is gone. All of their research facilities are now underwater, which, given the continent that they're in, would freeze over very quickly. that technology is going to take some time to recover. Sure, they were able to recover Amity Coliseum, as well as a number of the other airships that were flying over Atlas, so perhaps they'd be able to use Amity Coliseum as a basis, because it did have, you know, all of those biomes that operated off of different kinds of dust, and use that as a basis to be able to, you know, accelerate the process of returning that technology once Remnant stabilizes after the war is done. That is, even if dust exists at all anymore after the gods return. If they end up leaving Remnant afterwards and taking all magic with them, perhaps dust could go as well. But for that, we will have to wait and see. Since I mentioned Amity Coliseum, though, this is where we do get to see a lot of different types of dust. There is gravity dust that is used in one of the biomes, and we've seen that gravity dust does naturally occur in Mistral, where those floating islands were that we saw at the beginning of Volume 5. And gravity dust, we don't know the exact combination of the basic elements of dust that would go to contribute to its creation. But it naturally occurred in that area of the world, and once it did occur, it naturally caused those islands to levitate. The gravity dust would not have formed on those islands itself, it would have formed underneath the ground, and after however many years, the gravity dust crystals eventually push that clump of land up into the sky, and they remain floating to this day. Until, of course, they're mined by whatever dust company decides to do so. And on top of that, Atlas probably had discovered how to artificially create gravity dust as well, by figuring out the exact combination of the basic elements of dust would be needed to create gravity dust. The same would be true with any other dust that we have seen in the RWBY series. And heard about as well, because one of the dusts that we have heard about but have never seen in the RWBY series is plant dust. This is a type of dust that I would presume is somewhat related to earth dust. And that was always something that was surprising to me, is that earth dust is a type of dust that is not one of the basic forms of dust. It is formed from some combination of fire, wind, water, and lightning. What combination that would be? Not really sure. When it comes to earth dust in specific, though, I would almost imagine that earth dust would be the one that would be most influenced by the environment around it. Since dust is formed within the earth, then it could end up being that there is maybe a less concentrated vein of some other type of dust, whether it be wind, water, fire, etc., that would then absorb properties from the environment around it, have that act as a catalyst to then form earth dust. It has to have another dust crystal there as kind of a prerequisite, and then minerals from the earth are absorbed into it to create earth dust, or rock dust. That just seems to make sense to me. There's been no confirmation on that, but that would be something I would love to be able to delve into in the RWBY series, to see more of how just the world came to be and how the world of Remnant works. Following that same line of thinking, I would think that earth dust, once it's created, then by adding other forms of dust, whether it be wind dust to help influence the earth dust to turn into gravity, so then it can then raise into the air or something like that, and plant dust, maybe a little bit of fire dust added into there to give it the spark of life, or something along those lines. Probably water dust would be the more likely one to add to earth dust to give plant dust, but, you know, considering we don't actually have the combinations that would produce earth, plant, or gravity dust, I kind of like playing with that idea. The chemist in me kind of wants to piece these building blocks together. Still, we don't know the proportions behind them. And then even further than just the creation of dust is the building of technology that utilizes dust to function. Dust has become such an integral part of Remnant. Most technology utilizes dust in some way, shape, or form, and we've seen the cars that exist in Remnant operate off of dust. We've seen vehicles that use gravity dust to float. The train systems that we've seen use hard light dust as the center of their rails, and likely gravity dust to float on top of them as well. Combustion dust is probably one of the types of dust that is most widely used when it comes to the fueling of vehicles. That's what Yang's motorcycle Bumblebee runs on. It is combustion dust. That is essentially the common fuel in the world of Remnant. And there are fueling stations that exist, apparently some even just in the wilds of Mistral, that would provide combustion dust, similar to how in our world just gas stations provide fossil fuels. Dust is everywhere in Remnant. Technology utilizes it, and most importantly, most historically, it has been utilized in weapons. And there are different ways to utilize dust in weapons, and in conjunction with a given character's semblance as well. But when it comes to semblances, that's really on an individual basis. First of all, whether dust would have any effect with that person's semblance, and, you know, what that effect would actually be. So I'll just focus on weapons for the purpose of this video and, you know, the technology of it. Now, dust in weapons can be used in a more sustainable and long-lasting way, or it can be something to get more of an immediate effect. That being dust cartridges. The bullets that are used in most RWBY weapons contain some form of dust. Majority of them likely just contain combustion dust as a replacement for gunpowder. You know, something to make the gun go boom and the bullet go forward. That type of thing. But other types of dust have certainly been used. We've seen RWBY utilize lightning dust to electrify Nora back in Volume 4, and we've seen Ironwood utilize gravity dust rounds as well. Though, I would imagine utilizing rounds made from other types of dust is not exactly the most convenient way to utilize dust, as, well, once you fire off that one shot, the dust is all used up. Whereas if the dust is forged into a weapon, you get a more sustained use of that type of dust. We've seen characters like Octavia Ember that forge fire dust into her sword to give her sword a lasting fire effect. Now, it might not be as strong of an effect had you taken that exact same amount of fire dust and, you know, put it into a bullet and fire that at the enemy, but now she can utilize the fire dust for a longer period of time. And then there are characters like Dew Gale, or Amber, the previous Fall Maiden, whose weapons utilize just raw dust crystals so that they can create their effects. Wind dust, in the case of Dew, as well as Amber utilizing wind and fire dust in her staff. Utilizing the raw dust crystals themselves give them a more long-term use out of the crystal. That being said, though, as far as we've seen from raw dust crystals, they aren't the most, shall we say, stable thing on the planet, so I would wager that using raw dust crystals just in your weapon, if they are then, you know, smacked off of anything, if they experience any blunt force trauma, they might just explode, and that might be a bad thing for both parties involved. But one thing that is especially notable when it comes to dust and its utility in weapons is that whenever a character is utilizing the dust in their weapon, they can only utilize those specific elements. On its surface, that sounds obvious, but I've seen a lot of people, when they go to create their own original characters for the RWBY series, they add, you know, earth dust and fire dust to a weapon and expect that to create lava, or lava dust, the effects of lava dust. Also, slight tangent, it does appear that lava dust does exist in the RWBY series, and that was what we saw in the lava biome and Amity Coliseum. But when you combine rock dust and fire dust, as we saw with Leonardo Lionheart, who used all different types of dust within his weapon, all you get is a flaming rock. You don't end up getting the combination of that dust, because, as I mentioned before, the science behind dust is much more precise than that. You can't just take a crystal of wind dust, a crystal of fire dust, mash them together, and expect to get fire dust. The same with fire dust and water dust. You can't just mash those together and expect to get the result that is steam. Now, if you produced water and then heated it up, then yes, you could get steam that way. But, similar to how Weiss has done this before, most prominently in the fight against Marrow, she had to create ice on the floor first, then use fire from her weapon to create steam. Even though Weiss's weapon has all different combinations of dust, we haven't seen her specifically have water dust or use plant dust or anything like that in any combination, but she had to use the effects of dust individually to then create the effect of steam, because she does not actually have steam dust. So there is a precise way to create every form of dust that exists on Remnant. That is some combination of fire, lightning, wind, and water, to create the different dust types that we have come to know. Earth dust, gravity dust, plant dust, steam dust, combustion dust, and even hard light dust. Considering that, as far as we know, hard light dust is the only artificial dust that has been created thus far, I'm sure that there was tons of resources and money put into creating or trying to create different types of dust. But again, as we've seen, dust in its raw form is volatile. It is unstable. It is not something that can be very easily combined just by mashing it together, and I'm sure analyzing it has taken quite a bit of time as well. The creation of hard light dust is something I would love to have explored more in the RWBY series, and just the science behind dust in general, how it's created naturally and how Atlas went through the process of learning how to combine different forms of it, how they were able to get technology to work utilizing dust. It's also been mentioned before that there are other forms of energy resources that exist on Remnant, though we haven't really seen any shown on screen. Presumably every bit of technology that we've seen does operate off of dust in some way, shape, or form, even if that is receiving electricity from somewhere else. That would probably be created by electricity dust. If Remnant is somewhat similar to our world, then they should be able to generate electricity outside of the use of dust, but whether that technology has been developed, since dust is so widely used in the world, we just don't know at this point in time. But the science of dust is something that really intrigues me. And if you've watched this far in the video, well, thank you for listening to my ramblings on, well, the science of dust. And if you enjoyed this video, want to see more like it, make sure to subscribe and join the Guild of the Eternal Flame. I also stream on Twitch a couple times a week, so if you guys want to chat with me live about anything regarding RWBY, I guess, chemistry, though I won't help with your chemistry homework, or anything else for that matter, make sure to follow me there as well. And I will see you guys in the next video.